Thank you and hello. It's almost midnight here in our part of the world, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you here today. So I'm going to talk about long-term outcomes of a patient with posterior urethral valve. And obviously, it's of a lot of interest to many of us. Now, when we talk about the key topics that I'm going to cover over the next few minutes is types of transition care, bladder dysfunction, renal insufficiency outcomes, and renal transplant outcomes. Now, when we talk about transition care, Dr. Woodhouse has pointed out that there are various types. One would be to move to an adult doctor in the same specialty. While this may be possible for conditions such as diabetes and asthma, pediatric and urology or finding an adult urologist with an interest in pediatric urology is not always possible in many parts of the world. Of course, we could find a specialist for the chronic conditions, but once again, this is not always possible. Now, then, a lot of patients in most parts of the world rely on non-specialist care. What is the situation in my country? So most of us train as general surgeons and then as urologists. And then we take up a fellowship in a high-volume pediatric urology department abroad. And when we come back, what we try to do is to balance our pediatric urology responsibilities with day-to-day adult urology service, which usually includes reconstructive urology, functional urology, and transitional urology. As you can see here, even though we have many young doctors who train in pediatric urology, a lot of them leave to the private sector, which is why a lot of the senior urologists still have to remain to take care of the patients. But the benefit of this method is that we see the children from the time they're born right till they go into adulthood. Now, when we talk about bladder dysfunction, most of us who manage children with posterior urethral valves find that despite treatment with valve ablation, the bladder function is abnormal in up to 70% of the older children and adolescents. Now, why does this occur or how does this manifest? One, there could be delay in attainment of day and night urinary incontinence. Or we find that there is an upper tract dilatation associated with urinary incontinence, which we commonly refer to as valve bladder. So these are the two types of bladder dysfunction that we tend to see in older children with posterior urethral valves. Now, we also know that bladder dysfunction in patients with posterior urethral valve changes during the time that they are children, all through adolescence. And a lot of times the urodynamics shows a pattern of hypercontractility soon after the ablation, but then eventually it becomes detrusor underactivity, and in some patients there's even detrusor failure. So then the question is, why does this detrusor decompensation occur? There are some who believe that because of the cystoscopy findings of a hypertrophied bladder neck, that this detrusor decompensation may be related to a secondary bladder neck obstruction. We think this may be so, but none of us are actually very sure. Now, this is why urodynamics is one of the most important diagnostic tools in patients with posterior urethral valve as they grow older. Of course, there are initial non-invasive methods of assessing the bladder, such as the frequency volume chart and uroflowmetry. And the problem is that with a uroflowmetry, you may find someone who is able to void with a very good bell curve and a high maximal Qmax. But on the other hand, when you do a urodynamic, you find that their bladder pressures during this voiding is also very high. Now, let's have an example of one patient who had an ablation after he was born, and as he grew up, we found that his upper tract dilatation progressed. And when we do his urodynamics with fluoroscopy, we find that the bladder is very trabeculated, and there's early reflux into the left ureter, even when there's just 40 mils of urine filled up. And you also find that he leaks pretty early. He leaks when his bladder capacity is 87, and we can see that his bladder pressure is steadily and gradually rising. So this is one of the patients who also found that he had a rising creatinine, and this is what we refer to as valve bladder. Now, when it comes to management of patients with bladder dysfunction and posterior urethral valve, there are many treatment options available, but not everything works, not all the modalities work. Now, Dr. Ram Prasad's slides have been pretty helpful in identifying some of these treatment modalities, but let's go through some of them. So alpha blockers have been used because we find hypertrophy urethral ridge, and we think that there may be bladder neck hypertrophy. And as urologists, we're very familiar with using alpha blockers in patients with prostate enlargement. But does it really make a difference in the improvement of the patients avoiding symptoms, residual urine? We have not really found that much of a difference. And there are papers that have similar findings. Now, a lot of us have used anticholinergic medications for these patients, especially when they have leaks and small bladder capacity. But the main risk with using anticholinergic medication is that patients may have higher residual urine. And that is one of the commoner reasons why this medication is discontinued. Now, when we talk about bladder drainage, clean intermittent catheterization helps. But the problem is most of these patients with posterior urethral valve have a sensate urethra. And if CIC is initiated over a certain age, there are papers that say age 4, we find that CIC is a lot more difficult. It may work if CIC was started much, much earlier when the child was still an infant. Now, in patients who are approaching chronic kidney disease and end-stage kidney disease, but they are not ready for surgical procedures or they are too old to have a vesicostomy, then overnight bladder drainage does help. How does this work? A lot of patients with posterior urethral valves tend to be polyuric at night. And when they don't void during this period, their bladder pressures tend to be high. And most of us find that when we have overnight bladder drainage, we can slow down CKD progression. Now, what about management for patients with surgical interventions for patients with bladder dysfunction? Now, if you have a very young child, then a vesicostomy helps. But it's a little difficult to do vesicostomies in older children, mainly because they have continuous urinary incontinence, and you don't have diapers that are large enough to manage their vesicostomies. Now, augmentation cystoplasty is an option, and it would reduce the pressure and the detrusor overactivity that we find in patients with valve bladder, and that is something that we do utilize as a tool. There have been some papers that have looked into bladder neck incisions for patients with bladder neck hypertrophy. These are especially in the face of the bladder where it is a compensated bladder, but the outcome isn't very reassuring. Once again, as Dr. Ramprasad pointed out, there are papers that have reported use of high loop or a low loop refluxing ureterostomies. Though they may slow down CKD progression, there's no real long-term benefit. And there are also problems with managing these ureterostomies with a catheterizable, with a drainage device. Now, we've never explored, while botulinum toxin is used in patients with neurogenic bladder, we don't really have much data on the use of botulinum toxin in patients with posterior urethral valve. Part of the reason could be while botulinum toxin inhibits the release of acetylcholine in the presynaptic nerve endings, it works for neurogenic bladder, but in patients with posterior urethral valve, we find that most of the normal detrusor is replaced by fibrosis. And that is the reason why some of us feel that maybe botulinum toxin will not be helpful. But there is a recent paper which had some preliminary experience in using botulinum toxin in patients with PUV. And among their 15 patients, they have managed to improve the end-filling detrusor pressure, but it's not a very dramatic reduction in pressure. But there is some improvement in compliance, and this is something that we should explore further. But of course, the overall risk would be the patient having higher residual urines, and that may lead to a urinary tract infection. Now, Dr. Ramprasad has mentioned the value of nadir creatinine, and nadir creatinine does appear to be the single most important predictor that predicts the development of chronic kidney disease progression as well as valve bladder syndrome. But the word of caution is valve bladder can be both a cause of the renal insufficiency as well as an indicator of urinary tract dysplasia. Now, having discussed bladder dysfunction, let's talk about long-term kidney outcomes. Now, it is obvious based on everything that was commented on before, children with PUVs are at higher risk of developing adverse long-term kidney outcomes. And this includes death, dialysis, needing a kidney transplant, and chronic renal insufficiency. So this is why these patients need long-term follow-up. Now, the most significant prognostic factor is the nadir creatinine, and the cutoff values that have been provided include a value of more than 75 umoles. Any child with a nadir creatinine of more than 75 micromoles is likely to be at high risk, but any child with a nadir creatinine of less than 35 micromoles is considered to be at low risk. But the problem is, what about the children in the intermediate category or the group where they have a nadir creatinine of 35 to 75? We don't really know what happens to them. So other factors that have been studied that may be prognostic factors are age at diagnosis, having a pop-off mechanism, whether the child has recurrent UTI, vesicoureteric reflux, presence of vesicoureteric reflux, and whether there were abnormal antenatal ultrasound findings of echogenic kidneys, and whether there was maternal oligohydramnios. Because all these factors, some of these factors indicate pre-existing renal dysplasia. So I would not go into too much detail about renal transplant outcomes because that will be covered by our next speaker, Dr. McCarthy. But when it comes to management of the bladder before renal transplant, what the research shows is that early creation of Mitrofanoff catheterizable channel was associated with a delayed end-stage renal disease progression and need for dialysis. And there seems to be a pretty significant difference of 36 months versus 156 months. But at the end of the day, most of these patients eventually do develop end-stage kidney disease. But then again, having optimal bladder dysfunction treatment, including CIC, whether it is through the native urethral channel or through a catheterizable channel, might result in better long-term graft survival in patients with posterior urethral valve. So to summarize, children with posterior urethral valves are at higher risk of adverse long-term kidney outcomes. The nadir creatinine appears to predict development of gallbladder syndrome and chronic CKD progression. Treatment options delay, not prevent the onset of chronic renal insufficiency, but optimal bladder dysfunction treatment does improve long-term grafts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagappan. That was a wonderful summary.